Oh my God.
Diane Calloway had been planning this night for 3 months. Not the kind of planning that involves a caterer and a guest list, though there was plenty of that too, but the kind of planning that comes from a woman trying to say thank you to 25 years of her life. She wanted the flowers right. She wanted the photo slideshow to end on the picture of her and her husband on their wedding day, young and unaware of everything that was still ahead of them. She wanted her husband, Richard, to walk into that room and feel, for one night, like the luckiest man alive. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that somewhere else in the country, in a house she had never seen, another woman was getting ready for dinner too, and calling him by the same name. At 6:42 that evening, while Diane stood in her bathroom fixing an earring that would not sit right, her phone buzzed once on the counter. It was a text from a number she did not recognize. She almost ignored it. She had a party to host, a husband to greet, a night to protect. But something about the timing, the strange stillness of the message sitting there on the screen, made her pick up the phone anyway. She read it once. Then she read it again, slower, as if reading it more carefully might change what it said. Whatever those words were, they would not leave her for the rest of her life. This is a true story about a marriage that was never entirely hers to begin with, and a woman who spent 25 years believing she knew the man she married, only to learn on the one night meant to celebrate him that there was an entire life running parallel to her own, one she had never been invited into and never been told existed. It involves a second house 3 states away, 3 children who called him something she never expected, and a wedding ring that was not the only one he had ever given. By the time the candles were lit and the guests had raised their glasses that night, Diane Calloway's understanding of her own life had already begun to come apart, piece by piece, though almost no one in that room would notice until much later. She would spend the rest of the evening smiling for photographs, thanking friends for coming, cutting a cake shaped like a silver 25, all while carrying a piece of information she had not yet had time to process. By the end of that night, everything she believed about her marriage would collapse, and even then, she still would not know the full truth of what her husband had built without her. Before we go any further into how Diane found out and what she chose to do next, let us know in the comments where you are watching this from tonight. We would genuinely love to hear from you, and if you have not already, go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our upcoming stories. Who was Richard Calloway really? Was he simply a man who made one terrible choice and let it grow out of control, or was there something colder underneath the warmth everyone believed they saw in him? Did anyone around Diane suspect the truth long before she did? And if so, why did nobody ever say a word? These are the questions we are going to answer over the next hour, step by step, the same way Diane herself had to answer them, without a map, without warning, and without anyone to prepare her for what she was about to find. To understand how a woman can spend 25 years married to a man and still not know the whole truth about who he is, you have to go back to the beginning, long before the anniversary, long before the second house, back to 2 ordinary people who fell in love the way most people do, with no idea what was waiting for them decades down the road. Diane grew up in a small town outside Dayton, Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where Sunday dinners were sacred and a person's word still meant something. Her father ran a hardware store on Main Street for 30 years. Her mother taught 3rd grade. Diane was the middle of 3 sisters, the one everyone described as steady, the one who never caused her parents a single sleepless night. She was not the girl who dreamed of moving to a big city or chasing some unconventional life. She wanted what her parents had, a home full of noise and dinner smells and people who came back to the same table every single night. That was the whole dream, and for a long time, it seemed like she was getting exactly that. She met Richard at 21 at a mutual friend's backyard barbecue in the summer of 1999. He was 23, recently out of college, funny in a way that put people immediately at ease, the kind of man who could walk into a room of strangers and somehow know 3 of them by the time he left. Diane would say later that what drew her in was not any single grand gesture, but the way he listened. He asked questions and actually waited for the answers. He remembered small details from conversations weeks earlier. In a world where most people were only half paying attention to each other, Richard seemed fully present, and to a young woman raised to value steadiness above almost everything else, that presence felt like exactly what she had been looking for. They married 2 years later, in the fall of 2001, in a small church not far from where Diane grew up. Neither family had much money, so the reception was held in a rented hall with paper lanterns and a borrowed sound system, but everyone who was there still talks about it as one of the happiest days they can remember. Diane's father gave a toast that made half the room cry. Richard danced with his new mother-in-law and made her laugh so hard she had to sit down. It was, by every account, the beginning of an ordinary, hopeful marriage between two people who genuinely seemed to love each other. For the first several years, their life together looked exactly like the life Diane had always pictured. They bought a small 3-bedroom house in a quiet subdivision. Richard took a job as a territory sales representative for a mid-sized industrial equipment company, a role that started with occasional day trips and slowly grew into longer stretches on the road as he was promoted and given a larger territory to cover. Diane worked part-time at a pediatrician's office while raising their 2 children, a daughter born in 2003 and a son born 2 years after that. She built her entire identity around this family. She was the one who remembered every teacher's name, who organized the school bake sales, who kept a calendar on the refrigerator, color-coded for each child's activities. Stability mattered to her more than excitement. Loyalty mattered more than romance, and for most of her life, she never had a single reason to believe those 2 things were in conflict inside her own marriage. Richard's job continued to expand. By 2005, his sales territory had grown to cover several states, which meant he was gone anywhere from 10 to 14 days out of every month, sometimes more during what he called the busy season. He called home every single night without fail, usually right around the children's bedtime, and Diane came to treasure those calls. The sound of his voice describing some forgettable hotel room or client dinner, always ending the same way, telling the kids he loved them and asking Diane to save him a plate of whatever she had made for dinner that night. Nobody in Diane's life ever questioned this arrangement. Traveling salesman travel. That was simply the shape of his job, and an entire community of friends, neighbors, and family built their understanding of Richard and Diane's marriage around that shape, without a single person ever asking what filled the empty spaces in between his calls home. Looking back now, there were small things, the kind of things that only become visible once you already know to look for them. Around 2007, Richard began carrying a second cell phone, one he explained as strictly for work correspondence, separate from his personal line so client calls would not interrupt family time. He never let that phone out of his sight. It went into his pocket the moment he woke up and stayed there until he went to sleep. There were cash withdrawals over the years, small at first, then gradually larger, that never quite matched anything on their shared bank statements, explained away as client entertainment expenses that his company reimbursed separately. There were phone calls that came in during dinner, calls he would glance at and then quietly excuse himself to take outside, even in the middle of winter, standing in the cold on their front porch with his back to the house. At the time, none of it registered as anything more than the ordinary friction of a busy working life. A person only sees the shape of a lie once they already know to look for it, and for nearly 2 decades, Diane had no reason to look. To everyone who knew them, Richard and Diane were the couple other people envied. They celebrated milestones the way families are supposed to. Their 10th anniversary was a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in Michigan. Their 15th was a backyard party with close friends. Their 20th, in 2021, was the trip that people still bring up. A week on the North Carolina coast, sunsets and wine on the porch every evening, Richard's arm around Diane's shoulders in nearly every photograph from that week, as if nothing in the world could ever come between them. Their daughter had graduated college by then and moved to Columbus for a marketing job. Their son was finishing his engineering degree in Cincinnati. Both of them, independently, described their parents' marriage to friends as the model they hoped to find for themselves someday, a rare thing among their own generation, a love that had genuinely lasted. So when the 25th anniversary approached in the fall of this year, Diane wanted to do something that matched the weight of what she believed those 25 years represented. She began planning months in advance, working quietly with their 2 adult children and a small circle of close friends to put together a surprise gathering at their home, something warm and personal rather than a large formal event, exactly the kind of celebration Richard always said he preferred. Part of the planning involved putting together a photo slideshow tracing their whole life together, from their wedding day through every anniversary since, and it was during this search, digging through an old shared email account looking for photographs from a trip years earlier, that Diane found something she did not recognize at all. It was a florist order confirmation, dated nearly 3 years earlier, for an arrangement she had never received, delivered to an address she had never once heard her husband mention in 25 years of marriage. The signature line on the digital card read simply, "All my love, R." She stared at it for a long moment. Her first instinct, the instinct of a woman who had spent her whole life trusting the man beside her, was to assume it was some kind of mix-up, an old order sent to the wrong inbox, a clerical error from a florist's outdated system. It would have been so easy to close the tab and go back to choosing photographs for the slideshow. Instead, something quieter than logic, some instinct she could not fully explain even to herself, later, made her write the address down on a scrap of paper from the notepad by the phone, fold it in half, and slide it into the bottom of her purse instead of throwing it away. She told herself it was nothing at least 4 or 5 more times over the following days. She kept working on the party planning, kept smiling through school pickup and grocery runs, kept the scrap of paper tucked away like something she was not quite ready to look at directly. But late one night, nearly a week later, after Richard had gone to bed and the house had gone completely quiet, Diane sat down at the kitchen table with her laptop, pulled the folded paper from her purse, and typed the address into a search engine to see, once and for all, what would come up. What came up first was simple enough. A residential address, an ordinary house on an ordinary street, located in a mid-sized city nearly 900 miles away, a city Diane recognized instantly because it was a city Richard had visited so often for work over the years that she could have named the hotel he usually stayed at without having to think twice. For a moment, she almost felt relieved. A client's home, maybe? A business associate? There were 100 harmless explanations for why a florist order might be tied to a place he visited for work. Then she scrolled further, and attached to that address, through a property records site, was a name she did not recognize at all, listed as a co-owner of the home. Karen Whitmore. Diane sat with that name for a long moment, turning it over, waiting for it to mean something, and finding that it meant absolutely nothing to her. She had never heard Richard mention a Karen. Not a coworker, not a client contact, not a name that had ever once crossed the threshold of their home in 25 years. Curiosity, or perhaps something closer to dread, that had not yet found its shape, led her to search that name alongside the city. Within seconds, a public social media profile appeared, and on that profile were photographs, dozens of them, spanning years. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper scattered across a living room floor. Birthday parties with balloons and sheet cakes. A woman, presumably Karen, smiling in a kitchen that was not Diane's kitchen, wearing an apron Diane had never seen, standing at a stove Diane had never cooked on. Diane scrolled slowly at first, then faster, her chest tightening with every photograph, until she reached one taken at what appeared to be a backyard cookout, and standing slightly out of focus near the edge of the frame, a beer in one hand, laughing at something off camera, was a man who looked exactly like her husband. She told herself, one final time, that it could be a resemblance. People have doubles. The internet is full of coincidences. But as she kept scrolling backward through years of posts, the resemblance appeared again and again, always slightly out of focus, always at the edge of a frame, as if he had spent over a decade being careful about exactly how visible he allowed himself to become in someone else's photographs. And then she found a caption that stopped her entirely. A birthday post, 3 years old, congratulating someone's youngest child on turning 9 years old, tagged with a location at a restaurant in that same city. Diane did not need to check her memory for that date. She already knew it by heart, because it fell during the exact week Richard had told her he was taking a rare solo fishing trip to a cabin with no cell service, a trip he had described in such specific, affectionate detail afterward. The fish he caught, the quiet of the lake at sunrise, that she had never once thought to question it. She sat in silence at her kitchen table for a long time after that, the only light in the room coming from the laptop screen, scrolling further and further back through years of a life she had never known existed, a life that ran in a strange kind of parallel to her own, filled with its own holidays, its own inside jokes, its own ordinary domestic rhythm. She found herself doing something she never imagined she would have to do inside her own marriage, counting children in someone else's photographs. There were 3, a boy who looked to be around 12, a girl close to 10, and the youngest, the one whose 9th birthday she had just read about, a boy with the same easy, gap-toothed smile Diane recognized instantly, because it was nearly identical to a photograph of her own son at that same age. Over the following several days, Diane did not confront Richard. She did not scream, did not throw anything, did not do any of the things she imagined, in some detached corner of her mind, that a woman in this situation was supposed to do. Instead, she began quietly gathering everything she could find, working late at night after Richard had gone to sleep, working during the hours he was traveling, piecing together a picture with the same methodical patience she had once used to plan a nursery or organize a school fundraiser. She pulled old credit card statements from a filing cabinet in the garage, statements she had glanced at for years without ever really reading. She found hotel receipts tucked inside old coat pockets and desk drawers, receipts she had assumed were simply proof of legitimate business travel. She cross-referenced flight confirmation emails buried dozens of pages back in an old shared inbox neither of them used anymore. She began keeping her own private notebook, hidden inside an old cookbook on a high shelf, filling its pages with dates and cities and small details that, one by one, stopped looking like coincidence and started looking like a pattern deliberately built to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. Dates began to line up with an exactness that made her stomach turn. A hotel stay in that same city, timed almost perfectly with a Christmas post showing a decorated tree in a living room she now recognized. A flight booked the same week as a birthday party post. A rental car charge dated the exact weekend of what Diane now understood, with sick clarity, was actually a wedding anniversary, just not hers. Some nights she would sit at that table until 2 or 3 in the morning, comparing dates so long that the numbers seemed to blur together, and still she kept going, because some part of her needed to know the entire truth before she allowed herself to feel any of it. What Diane did not know yet, what she could not have imagined even as the evidence continued stacking up night after night on her kitchen table, was that this was not an affair in any conventional sense, and it was not a mistress kept quietly on the side. As she kept digging, she found something that made her hands go still over the keyboard. A marriage license, filed in a county clerk's public record database, listing Richard Calloway and Karen Whitmore as husband and wife, dated 4 years after her own wedding to him. Not a second relationship, a second marriage, a second wedding ring, purchased on a joint credit card statement she had somehow overlooked for over a decade. A second mortgage, taken out under both their names. 3 children who had grown up their entire lives calling her husband Dad, in a home Diane had never once been invited into. 3 states away from the only marriage she had ever believed was real. Diane did not confront Richard right away, even with all of this laid out in front of her. As much as every instinct told her to walk into their bedroom and demand answers that same night, some steadier, more deliberate part of her insisted on understanding the complete shape of what she was dealing with before she said a single word to him. She wanted proof that could not be explained away, could not be talked around with the same easy charm that had first drawn her to him 25 years earlier. Late one night, hands shaking, she searched online for private investigators in her area and found one with decent reviews, a woman named Patricia Ross who specialized in exactly this kind of case. Diane called the number before she could talk herself out of it, and when Patricia picked up, Diane heard herself say out loud, for the first time, a version of the truth she had barely allowed herself to think in words. "I think my husband might have another family." From that point forward, every single day became a kind of countdown, each new piece of information Patricia uncovered, arriving a little closer to the date already circled in red on Diane's calendar, the 25th anniversary party she had spent months planning, a celebration that was now going to mean something entirely different than anything she had originally intended. Patricia Ross worked quickly. Within the first week, she confirmed what the property and marriage records had already suggested, but with far more detail than Diane had been able to gather on her own. The marriage between Richard and Karen had taken place in a small courthouse ceremony in 2005, in a state that, at the time, did not cross-reference marriage applications against other state databases, meaning a man could apply for a marriage license there without the clerk ever discovering he already had a wife 900 miles away. Patricia explained that this was not as rare a loophole as most people assumed, that bigamy cases, while still illegal everywhere in the United States, often went undetected for years, or even decades, specifically because record systems between states rarely communicated with each other unless someone specifically went looking. The financial picture Patricia assembled was staggering in its scope. Richard had been contributing to a mortgage on the second home for 21 years, a modest 3-bedroom house not unlike the one he shared with Diane, purchased jointly with Karen only 16 months after their courthouse wedding. He had claimed the 3 children as dependents on a separate tax filing that existed entirely apart from the joint returns Diane had signed alongside him every single year, something that would have required either a second Social Security filing under circumstances Patricia said were still unclear, or an arrangement Karen herself may have unknowingly participated in, believing it to be entirely legitimate. This was the point where the investigation stopped being simply about proving Richard's guilt and started raising a question that would follow Diane for the rest of this story. Did Karen know about her? Was Karen, in some way, complicit in this deception, benefiting from a marriage she understood to be exclusive when it was not? Or was she every bit as unaware and deceived as Diane had been for over 2 decades? Patricia's early findings suggested the second possibility was far more likely. Neighbors interviewed near the second home described Richard as a devoted, if frequently traveling, husband and father, someone who coached his youngest son's Little League team when he was in town, someone who Karen had reportedly told friends worked long stretches away from home due to a complicated custody arrangement from an earlier relationship, a story specific enough, and just believable enough, to explain away years of unexplained absences without ever raising suspicion. There was, however, one detail that complicated this picture and that Patricia flagged for Diane directly. A next-door neighbor, speaking anonymously, mentioned that a woman fitting Karen's description had once asked, seemingly offhand, whether it was normal for a husband's job to require quite so much unaccounted travel, a comment made at a neighborhood gathering roughly 6 years earlier and apparently never raised again. It was impossible to know, even with everything Patricia had uncovered, whether this was simply an idle passing comment or a moment of genuine, quickly suppressed suspicion that Karen had chosen, for reasons of her own, not to pursue any further. This ambiguity would remain unresolved for weeks, a question mark sitting uncomfortably at the center of an already devastating investigation. Diane, in the meantime, met with a family law attorney to understand exactly where she stood legally, a conversation she described afterward as one of the strangest hours of her entire life, sitting in a quiet office discussing the legal architecture of a marriage she had believed, until 3 weeks earlier, was simply and uncomplicatedly her own. The attorney explained the reality in plain terms. Bigamy is a criminal offense in all 50 states, and in nearly every legal framework in the country, only the first legally recorded marriage is recognized as valid, meaning any marriage entered into after that point, regardless of how long it lasted or how many children resulted from it, holds no legal standing whatsoever. This meant that, in the eyes of the law, Diane had always been Richard's only true wife. It also meant that Karen, through no fault of her own, had spent 21 years married to a man she had no legal claim to at all, a realization that would eventually complicate custody, inheritance, and property questions on a scale neither woman could have anticipated walking into this. But knowing the legal reality did nothing to soften the emotional one. Diane learned, through Patricia's careful reporting, that Karen's 3 children believed with complete, unquestioning sincerity that their father was a hard-working, devoted man who simply traveled too often for a job none of them fully understood the details of. It was, Diane realized with a kind of quiet horror, Almost exactly the same story her own two children had grown up believing, without a single doubt for their entire lives. Two families, 3 states apart, each one certain they possessed the whole and complete truth of who this man was, each one equally wrong. As the investigation deepened into its 3rd week, Patricia uncovered something that added an entirely new layer of complexity to the story. Richard's travel patterns, once mapped against both households over more than 2 decades, revealed a rigid, almost military precision to how he had divided his time. Roughly 3 weeks with Diane's family, 1 week with Karen's, repeating in a cycle that had apparently held steady, with only minor variation, since the early 2000s. Patricia noted this was, in her professional experience, unusually disciplined, suggesting a level of intentional planning that went far beyond a situation that had simply gotten out of hand. This had not been an accident that spiraled. This had been managed, calendar by calendar, year after year, for over 2 decades. Diane spent these weeks living 2 lives of her own in a sense, continuing to host school pickups and grocery runs and casual conversations with neighbors as though nothing had changed, while privately absorbing information that was steadily dismantling every assumption she had ever made about her marriage. She told no one, not even her own adult children, not yet. She wanted, she said later, to understand the complete truth before she asked anyone else to carry the weight of it alongside her, though in hindsight, she would wonder whether that decision to carry it alone for so long had cost her more than it protected her. By the 4th week, with the anniversary party now only days away, Diane made a decision that surprised even Patricia. Rather than confronting Richard privately, quietly, in the safety of their own kitchen, where he might once again find the right words to soften or explain away what she now knew with absolute certainty, Diane decided the confrontation would happen exactly where he least expected it, in front of the very people whose good opinion he had spent 25 years so carefully protecting. The morning of the anniversary party, Diane moved through her usual routine with a composure that unsettled even her. She helped set up chairs in the backyard. She arranged the silver and gold balloons her daughter had picked up the day before. She placed the banner reading 25 years above the fireplace mantel, her hands steady in a way that felt almost foreign to her, given everything she now knew. Richard spent the morning running errands, picking up extra ice and a bottle of wine he said was for a special toast later that evening, entirely unaware that his wife had spent the past 4 weeks quietly assembling a case file thick enough to end the life he had spent over 2 decades constructing. Guests began arriving around 6 that evening. Neighbors, longtime family friends, Richard's co-workers, Diane's 2 sisters who had driven in from out of state, and both of their adult children, home for the occasion, beaming with genuine pride at what they still believed was simply their parents' 25th anniversary celebration. The house filled quickly with laughter and the particular warm chaos of a party in full swing, string lights glowing along the porch, the smell of catered barbecue drifting from the backyard, someone's playlist of old favorites playing just loud enough to fill the silences between conversations. Richard was, by every visible measure, having the night of his life. He moved easily through the crowd, the way he always did, remembering names, asking about people's children, refilling drinks, accepting congratulations with the same easy charm that had made him so effortlessly liked for as long as anyone in that room had known him. He had no idea that the folder Patricia had prepared, containing copies of the marriage license, property records, and select photographs, sat upstairs in Diane's closet, and he had no idea that his wife had spent the entire evening watching him from across the room with an expression that, to anyone who knew to look for it, might have seemed slightly too composed for a woman simply enjoying her own party. Around 8 o'clock, as the sun finished setting and the backyard lights took over, Diane's daughter gathered the guests together for the toasts, the traditional highlight of any anniversary celebration. Richard's toast came first, warm and funny, thanking Diane for 25 years of partnership, drawing genuine laughter and a few tears from the crowd, the kind of speech that would have made anyone believe, without a single doubt, that they were witnessing the anniversary of a truly happy marriage. When it was Diane's turn to speak, she asked for a moment, and the room quieted the particular way a room quiets when something in a person's tone signals that what comes next is going to matter. She did not raise her voice. She did not cry. Not yet. She began by thanking everyone for coming, for 25 years of friendship and support, her voice steady and warm in a way that gave no immediate indication of what was about to happen. Then, still calm, she said that she wanted to share something she had learned recently, something about the true shape of the last 25 years of her marriage. She spoke about a woman named Karen. She spoke about 3 children, a boy of 12, a girl of 10, and a boy who had just turned 9, all of them living in a home 900 miles away, all of them believing, with complete sincerity, that their father simply traveled often for work. She did not raise her husband's name at first, letting the details accumulate in the silence of the room, watching the confusion on people's faces slowly shift into something closer to dawning horror as they began, one by one, to understand exactly who she was describing. By the time she finally said his name, most of the room already knew. Richard's face, guests would describe afterward, went a shade of pale. None of them had ever seen on him before. He opened his mouth as though to explain, to offer some version of the charm that had smoothed over every difficult moment of his life until this one, but nothing came out. Diane, still remarkably composed, delivered the line that would echo through every conversation about that night for years afterward. 25 years ago, you promised me forever, she said. I just found out I was sharing it. What followed was chaos held together by shock rather than volume. Diane's sisters moved instinctively to her side. Her adult children stood frozen, their faces cycling through disbelief, then something closer to grief, as they began to understand that an entire version of their childhood, an entire understanding of who their father was, had just been rewritten in front of them. Richard attempted, haltingly, to explain, to ask for privacy, to suggest this was a conversation better had away from the party, but the moment for privacy had already passed. Within 20 minutes, at the quiet but firm insistence of Diane's brother-in-law, Richard left his own anniversary party, walking out to his car under the same string lights that, an hour earlier, had been glowing over what everyone believed was a celebration of 25 happy years. As his car pulled out of the driveway, Diane's phone rang. It was a number she did not recognize, calling for the very first time in her life. She answered it standing alone on the back porch, away from the stunned murmur of the remaining guests, and heard a woman's voice on the other end, shaking, asking if this was Diane. It was Karen, who, Diane would learn over the following minutes, had received a call from Richard only 20 minutes earlier. A call in which he had, in a panic, told her everything, all at once, in a way that left Karen with no time to process anything before dialing Diane's number herself. The conversation between the two women that night began, understandably, in tense and uncertain territory. Two strangers, who had unknowingly shared the same husband for over 2 decades, each one bracing for anger from the other. But as they continued talking, carefully, haltingly, both women began to realize something neither had expected to feel that night. Neither of them had done anything wrong. They had simply loved the same man, each one completely unaware of the other's existence, and the person responsible for the devastation now unfolding in both of their lives was not each other, but him. In the weeks that followed, the fallout reached every corner of both families. Richard was formally charged with bigamy, a felony offense in the state where the second marriage had taken place, and faced separate legal proceedings related to the tax filings Patricia had uncovered during the investigation. Diane's attorney confirmed what the earlier consultation had suggested, that her marriage remained the only one legally recognized, though this legal clarity did little to simplify the tangled financial reality of 2 decades of shared mortgages, joint accounts, and commingled retirement savings that now had to be untangled through the courts. Karen, for her part, found herself in an even more precarious position, having built 21 years of her adult life around a marriage that had never legally existed, with no automatic claim to assets she had believed, in good faith, belonged equally to her and her husband. In the months that followed, as the legal proceedings ground forward, Diane and Karen spoke several more times, cautious conversations at first, focused mostly on the practical matter of how to explain the situation to 5 children between them, who had suddenly, and without any preparation, discovered they had half-siblings living hundreds of miles away. What emerged from those conversations, slowly and somewhat unexpectedly, was not the bitter rivalry many people might have predicted, but something closer to a wary, respectful understanding between two women who recognized in each other the exact same grief. Roughly 8 months after that anniversary party, Diane's children and Karen's children met for the first time, at a neutral meeting arranged carefully by both mothers, in a public park roughly halfway between their two home states. Diane described it afterward as one of the strangest and most emotional afternoons of her life, watching her own son and daughter sit across a picnic table from 3 children who shared their father's smile, their father's laugh, their father's exact same easy way of putting strangers at ease within minutes of meeting them. What made a deception of this scale possible for over 2 decades came down, in the end, to a combination of distance, careful timing, and a man who had become remarkably, almost professionally skilled at keeping 2 completely separate lives from ever touching. He had chosen a career that provided a built-in explanation for extended absences. He had chosen 2 households far enough apart that neither family's social circles ever intersected. And he had maintained, for over 20 years, a level of psychological discipline that both women, independently, described as the most disturbing part of the entire story. More disturbing even than the deception itself, the sheer sustained effort it must have taken to keep 2 entire families, 2 entire emotional worlds, completely separate for so long without ever once slipping. Diane, in the time since, has slowly and deliberately rebuilt her own life. She sold the house she and Richard shared for 25 years and moved into a smaller home closer to her daughter in Columbus. She has, somewhat to her own surprise, become someone other women going through similar discoveries reach out to for guidance and quiet understanding, having found, in sharing her story, a version of purpose she had not expected to find on the other side of something so devastating. Richard, following his legal proceedings, lost the trust and the presence of both families almost entirely, seeing his children from each household only sporadically, if at all, a consequence that Diane says she takes no satisfaction in, only a kind of sad, settled clarity. In the end, this was never really a story about a man who told one lie. It was a story about 2 women who each discovered, on the exact same night, that the family they believed they knew completely was only ever half of the picture, and about what happens when 2 people who had every reason to become enemies chose, instead, something quieter and far more difficult, a fragile kind of grace toward each other and toward the children, caught in the middle of a truth neither of them had ever been given the chance to see coming. Would you have spotted the red flags along the way? The second phone, the calls stepped outside to take, the precisely timed travel schedule that never quite varied. If you were Diane, would you have confronted him that night in front of everyone who loved them, or would you have waited for a quieter, more private moment? And if you were Karen, discovering the same truth from the other side of it, do you think you could have found your way to the kind of understanding she and Diane eventually reached, or would the anger have simply been too much to move past? Tell us what you think in the comments below. We read every single one, and we would genuinely love to know how you would have handled a truth this size. Stories like Diane's are rare, but they are not as rare as most people assume. Every year, cases of undisclosed second marriages surface in courtrooms across the country, and the common thread running through nearly all of them is the same quiet, devastating realization that the people closest to us are also, in some sense, the hardest people to ever fully verify. Trust, by its very nature, does not come with proof attached. It is something we extend because the alternative, living in constant suspicion of the people we love, is its own kind of unbearable. If this story moved you, and if you want to hear more true stories like this one, stories about the hidden lives people build right alongside the ones we think we know completely, go ahead and hit that subscribe button now, because a new story just like this one is coming every single week. And if you thought what Diane discovered was hard to believe, wait until you hear about the woman who discovered her husband's other family was living just 3 houses down her own street the entire time, hiding in plain sight for over a decade. That story is coming very soon, and you will not want to miss it. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end of this one. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we will see you in the next story.